Good morning. My name is Jill Dickerson. I'm a deacon here at Mercy View. I'll be reading today from 1 Samuel 18, verses 6 through 30. These verses can be found on page 138 in the ESV Bibles under the chairs. If you don't have a Bible, please feel free to take one home with you today. It's our gift to you. 1 Samuel 18, 6 through 30. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand. Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." But David evaded him twice. Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence, and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. And all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." And David said to Saul, "Who am I, and who are my relatives, and my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" But at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel, the Mahothalite, for a wife. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, "Let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Therefore Saul said to David a second time, "Now you shall now be my son-in-law." And Saul commanded his servants, "Speak to David in private and say, 'Behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you.' Now then, become the king's son-in-law." And Saul's servants spoke those words in the ears of David. But David said, "Does it not seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation?" And the servants of Saul told him, "Thus and so did David speak." Then Saul said, "Thus shall you say to David, 'The king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies.'" Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. But when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and went, along with his men, and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And David gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. But when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. This is the word of the Lord.
Praise be to God. Thank you, Jill. Good morning. Good to see everybody. Welcome to Mercy View. My name is Brad. I'm one of the pastors here. And just want to echo Trey's welcome to you. If you are visiting with us for the first time, welcome. I know also we have our friends from Will Rogers here with us this morning as well. We want to say a special welcome to you. Honored to have you with us in worship this morning. We want to, as we always do, say a huge thank you to you for your kingdom-mindedness, your graciousness to allow us to worship here on Sunday mornings in your space. We are so grateful for that. You don't know how much that means to us, and thank you actually is not enough, but we want to make sure and say that as often as we can, particularly when we're hanging out together like this. I wonder if you have ever had a crack in your windshield that initially seemed pretty harmless at first, but it began to grow, and then it grew even more, and maybe grew to the point where it was starting to obstruct your ability to see out the windshield, and really got to the point where you're like, it's time to replace this windshield. We have that going on, or we're really close to that right now in our van. And it's funny how this happens, right? You notice that little chip in your windshield. You don't think a whole lot of it. You think, man, that's probably not a big deal. It's a small crack. But over time, that crack begins to spread, and it starts to get close to, like it is for us right now, it's getting close to this, obstructing kind of how to actually, the thing that we need to be able to do with the windshield, right? Look out the windshield. That's going to maybe be a problem unless it's time to get the windshield replaced, basically, for us in the van. But here's the thing. This is why I'm bringing this to mind this morning. Jealousy is a lot like a cracked windshield. At first, it may seem very insignificant to you. Like it may seem very innocent, actually, at the very beginning. But over time, it will grow. And eventually, it can distort everything you see. Like you might say about this idea of jealousy that really to be jealous of something or someone, Brad, like that's just kind of a normal part of life. It's sort of an innocent thing to deal with. Isn't this just sort of like a natural human part of life? But the small crack idea in the windshield, just like jealousy, if it's left unchecked, can begin to affect everything in your life. It can begin to cloud things like your relationships with your spouse or with other friends, other family maybe. It can begin to distort your relationship with God, actually. It actually can distort how you see yourself as well. And if that's true, if it's true that jealousy, unchecked, uninhibited, unrepented of, can grow in such a way that it begins to distort the way that we see ourselves, the way that we see God, the way that we see others, what does the Bible have to say to us about it? Like, is there a way for us to repair the cracks of jealousy in our lives before it hijacks and robs us of peace and vision? Like, how do we stop that small crack of envy becoming something much bigger? Something that ends up maybe even consuming us and altering how we see ourselves and others and God. Today we are continuing a series in the book of 1 Samuel called In Search of a King. And today we are we've kind of passed the halfway point already. We're sort of moving into the home stretch of this book. And today we're going to see the continuation of something that we looked at last week. And as we do this here in this chapter 18 of 1 Samuel, I want you to see three things. And here they are. The first is this: jealousy, unchecked, poisons relationships. Jealousy, unchecked, poisons relationships. Second, jealousy unrestrained undermines relationships as well. So it both poisons relationships, and it also undermines relationships. We're going to see the distinction there, the difference there. Those are two different things. But lastly, the solution to jealousy or envy is to take in something and to trade out some other things. All right? So maybe we could just say it this way. Jealousy, the solution to jealousy is to take in and to trade out. All right? You'll see what that looks like here in just a moment. So if you have your Bibles or electronic devices, keep them open to 1 Samuel 18, beginning there in verse 6. And as you're looking there, if you remember last week, we entered 1 Samuel 18 right after David's defeat of the giant from Gath, Goliath. All right? Now, at the top of 1 Samuel 18, what actually happened is that the camera was like brought in on one of the outcomes of the defeat of Goliath. And this was the positive outcome. The camera was brought in on the friendship of David and Jonathan. And then we saw, in our passage today, we're looking at another outcome of that same event at the end of 1 Samuel 17, the defeat of Goliath. And this is the negative outcome today. This is something that negatively came out of that. And it's interesting because as you look back at verses 1 through 5, what you really have there coming out of 1 Samuel 17 is a flash forward. Now, I'm going to show my age here just a little bit, but has anybody watched the show Lost? Anybody know that show? Yeah. Probably my favorite drama of all time. When they started doing flash forwards, it like blew my mind. It was like, what is going on here? This is amazing. That's what happened in verses 1 through 5 as you look at the end of 1 Samuel 17. So verses 1 through 5 of 1 Samuel 18. And I say that because as we move into verse 6 here of 1 Samuel 18, what you actually have coming out of the first 5 verses of this book, or this chapter, is a flashback. Actually, what you have happening beginning in verse 6 is happening directly after what happened at the end of 1 Samuel 17. Is everybody with me? All right? I'm trying to help you get some chronology here. But this is what is happening in this, by the way, a flashback, another lost staple. But here's what's happening in verse 6 as we enter this. It says that as they were coming home, this is the nation of Israel, from the conquest of Goliath, it says that the women of all of the cities, the major cities in Israel, were coming out as the armies were coming home, singing, and they were dancing. And they were singing and dancing to meet King Saul, to meet the fighters of the armies. And I want you just to imagine this scene. The streets of all these cities are alive. There are women that are celebrating the triumph of Israel's God. It is a party. But in the midst of all of that praise, something starts to emerge. David is not just the talk of the town. The women are literally singing about how much more David has struck down than Saul. Do you see that? Like Saul has only struck down thousands, but David has struck down 10,000s. The women are singing that song. Now that does not sit well with Saul. Look there at verse 8. It says that Saul became very angry, and he immediately was consumed by what I would call insecurity. And it says in verse 9 that from that day on, Saul, in the ESV, it says he eyed David. What does that mean? It means that where he should have seen David as a fellow ally, someone who could be the hope for the nation of Israel, maybe a future king for the nation of Israel. We know that that is what's going to happen. Saul, even at this point, doesn't necessarily know that. Instead of seeing David that way, what he began to do from that day forward is saw David as a threat. And then in verse 10, it says that a harmful spirit came upon Saul. Again, remember this happened back in 1 Samuel 16. But in this chapter, we see that it actually, we get to see some of the ways that this plays itself out. It says that Saul began to rave, right? He began to publicly be angry and rave about, and it says that he actually had a spear in his hand while he was doing this. And not only that, he actually tried to throw that spear twice at David. And somehow David escaped from both of those attempts on his life. And I want you to notice something, though. Notice that the writer when he talks about the spear of Saul, he calls it the spear. Now, the only spear mentioned so far in the book of 1 Samuel was whose? Goliath's. Now, even if it's not the same spear, it's likely not the same spear. Goliath's spear would have been too big for any normal-sized man to kind of hold. But I do think we're supposed to see the connection here. Saul was using a spear like a Philistine would, like Goliath would have. And what was in our story today, in David's hand? Right? We know in the story when he defeats Goliath, he has very simple tools, things that he probably would have used as a shepherd to ward off, animals and stuff. In the palace, David doesn't have a spear in his hand. He has, Richard's doing this for him, he's playing his harp. We're supposed to notice this. David's power was still, we still see this, he trusts in God. It is with the power of God. The power of the harp was meant to represent that. That's what we're supposed to see here. While Saul's power was meant to show us that he's still in this world. He's not thinking of God. He doesn't see his power in God. Saul is fighting like the enemies of God, even in his own palace, against the man of God, David. Now look with me, if you would, at verse 12. Here's the insight, I think, that we need to grab to really understand why Saul is so consumed with jealousy here of David. Let me read that for us again. Here's what it says. Look there, verse 12. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, David, but had departed from Saul. See, Saul is recognizing something here, and it's not the first time that he's recognized this. In fact, I think what we begin to see in our story today is this recognition is starting to overwhelm Saul to the point it's going to make him kind of like lose his own sense of like what is good and right, okay? Listen, he is seeing, again, David's victories were not just the result of David being a skillful, like part of an army, a soldier, but because it says here that the Lord was with David. And he was with David in a way that he was not with Saul any longer. And I actually think Saul's fear isn't just about David's popularity here. It's not just about, man, I really would love to have the same kind of acclaim that David has. It's about the loss of God's favor. And again, instead of repenting, this is another moment Saul could repent. He doubles down on his fear. He doubles down on his anger. And he begins to make David the scapegoat for his own spiritual decline. And you'll notice that he removes David from the palace in verse 13, and it says that then David went out and came in before the people, which is language that's meant to help us see, like, David effectively at this point is taking over the military side of what Saul would have been doing. He's now really the military leader in a lot of ways. And we see in verses 14 and 16, and actually down in verse 30 as well, that David, in this role, experienced much success. And he was admired by all. Now don't miss this. Saul has removed David from his presence. Why? Like he can't even look at David anymore. He is so jealous of David. And this brings me to the first thing I want to invite you to see this morning, and it is this. Jealousy, unchecked, poisons relationships. Let's think about this for just a moment. When Saul heard the song of the women, David's name was louder than his own. And when that happened, something twisted inside of him. And at first, it was hidden. It was more inside, right? Or you could just see the way it was described. It was described as sort of angry displeasure. That's not like total unbridled hatred yet, but it is on the road there. But here's the thing with jealousy, and this is what we see in our story with Saul here. If unchecked, it never stays small. It festers. It grows. It's like a cancer. And we see Saul's displeasure in our story today morph into, listen, envy. He didn't just want what David had. He began to resent him for having it at all. That's the lie that jealousy or envy always tells you, by the way. It makes someone else's gain feel like your personal loss. See, Saul could have seen, I said this just a while ago, he could have seen David as a gift to the nation of Israel, because he was. Like a faithful warrior fighting for the same kingdom. But instead, Saul saw David now as opposition. So Saul's spear, this is another way to think of the spear thing, wasn't just an instrument of violence like him trying to kill David. It was the physical manifestation of a heart infected by jealousy. See, jealousy, like I just said, it often starts it feels very innocently to us. It's very small. It's sort of like a passing thought maybe that happens to you, a twinge of comparison that maybe you feel with someone else. Maybe it's a little bit of like a whisper in the soul that says, why them and not me? But like a seed that gets lodged in the cracks of a bitter heart, it begins to take root. It can, if it's left unchecked. And before you know it, that small seed has grown into a very, very thorny vine that's wrapped itself around your heart in all kinds of ways. In other words, it can actually turn into something much darker. So let me ask you, and this is a pointed question, but so get ready, okay? Who are you jealous of? Like, who in your life feels like a threat to you, maybe because of their success? Like, if you were to be really honest this morning, in your heart of hearts, are you secretly rejoicing in the hope that they will fail in some way so that you can feel better about yourself? Like, when was the last time with this person you're thinking of that you celebrated their success without feeling resentment creeping in with them? As we see in our story today, if you let jealousy simmer against somebody, unchecked, unrepented of, it won't just harm them, it will harm you. It has been said that unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Jealousy is the same. It will corrode your soul and warp the way that you see yourself, the way that you see others, the world, ultimately God. And this will be not a pretty thing for you to walk through. This was Saul in our story, and it can be us as well. Make no mistake, jealousy, unchecked, will poison your relationships. Now look with me, if you would, beginning in verse 17. Here we see that when a frontal assault failed for Saul, he turns to more covert methods. So Saul first, in our story today, offers one of his daughters, Merab, as a reward, I'm going to put that in quotes, as a reward for David's service to the nation of Israel. Saul's out of his mind and jealous right now. It's not really a reward, but that's how he's going to pitch it to David. But he's also kind of pitching it as a way to get, I think, and this is somewhat shrewd on Saul's part, to get David to continue to fight for him, kind of like a pledge to continue to fight for Saul in battle. But David sidesteps the offer. Did you see that? And he does it. I don't know if he's being like genuinely like, I'm not worthy, that kind of a thing. That's kind of what it looks like on the surface. Could just be that he's really shrewd as well here and knows this is not a good move for him, but he sidesteps the offer, and it says that daughter that Saul was going to give away, Merab, is married off to another man. But Saul isn't done. Look there in verse 20. Saul finds out that another one of his daughters is in love with David, Michal. And Saul gets another thought here. He's like, maybe I could take advantage of this. Look there at what happens. He says, let me give her to him, there in verse 20, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Now, this is in Saul's thought life, right? It says that this is what Saul thought. This is inside, but he's thinking about how to take what is inside, what is maybe more hidden, and bring it out into the real world for David to try to harm him, put him in harm's way. Now, in the Bible, the word snare that we see in verse 20 is often used to describe entrapments to idolatry. In fact, we're going to see in 1 Samuel 19 that Michal, this daughter, has idols in her home. In other words, this is likely not someone who's a follower of God. And so here's how Saul is conniving here. He is thinking, if I can get if I can get David to marry my daughter, Michal, maybe I can neutralize him. Maybe I can get him to turn away from Yahweh. And somehow, some way, I think he's thinking maybe he can somehow salvage his kingship here. So Saul puts his plan into place. Look at verse 22. He sends his servants to flatter him by saying, again, this is in quotes, that it would be a delight for the king to have David as his son-in-law. But notice David's response. Again, in verse 23, he says basically the same thing he said earlier. I'm too poor, I'm too insignificant for such an honor. But Saul seizes upon David's meekness here, and he decides to craft a price for his daughter that was, on the one hand, bizarre, and also meant to be strategically deadly. He wanted him to kill 100 Philistines and to take from those Philistines, those men, their foreskins. Yes, you heard that right. So David accepts the challenge, and not only does he meet the requirement, he doubles it. He slays 200 Philistines. And as it says there in verse 27, David exceeds what even Saul asked him to do. So what's happening here? Well, Saul is scheming, but his scheming backfires spectacularly, forcing him now then, because this was the price for Michal, to give his daughter Michal to David in marriage. So rather than eliminating David, the very plan that Saul designed to undermine David is only going to serve, it's happening already, but it's going to continue to happen, to accelerate his rise as king. Now, look with me there at the beginning of verse 28. What is Saul's response to all of that? Let me read that again. Here's what it says. This is going to sound familiar. But when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. And so Saul was David's enemy continually. So, again, instead of recognizing God's hand at work through David for Saul and the nation of Israel, and ultimately repenting, listen here, Saul triples down. And this time he allows his fear to metastasize into pure hatred of David. Why? Again, it's not just David's military successes that trouble Saul. It's the realization that the Lord is with David and not with him any longer. And that infuriated Saul. And in the chapters that follow, that fear of David and the realization of God's removal of favor turns into, and you will see this, into an all-out campaign to literally destroy David. So let's think about what we're talking about this morning. This is what jealousy can do. It can, if unchecked and unrepented of, seek to eliminate what it perceives as a threat. Now, not necessarily through physical destruction like we see in our story today, but through other means like slander, manipulation, sort of quiet sabotage. It's all very ugly stuff. This brings me to the second thing I want you to see in our passage today, and it's this: jealousy, unrestrained, undermines relationships as well. We see this in our story today in the way that Saul uses his own family to try to undo David, right? Saul was so consumed with envy that he disguised his hatred as an opportunity. And he sent him on what he thought would be a suicide mission. And not only that, he weaponized his own daughter to try and to bring David down to his level of spiritual compromise. And this is what jealousy can do. We just said it can poison our own hearts, and that's more of an internal thing, it can also push us to take action, to turn into manipulators and schemers or users of people. See, Saul didn't just stew in his envy, and it didn't just stay inside. He began to set traps for David. He began to pull strings, and he used his power and the people closest to him as pawns. This is what jealousy can do to us. It can warp our motives until we convince ourselves that our scheming is justified. And it turns relationships into battlefields. We asked earlier who are you jealous of? Who do you envy? And for some of you, a person came to mind. Maybe it's more than one person came to mind. For some of you that answered that question honestly in your heart, that jealousy is currently hidden. It's concealed. But you're nursing it. You're letting it simmer just beneath the surface, convincing yourself that it's harmless. But we see in the life of Saul here that jealousy doesn't always just stay in the dark corners of our heart. It's not okay for it to be there. But in the story of Saul, we can see that kind of jealousy can move out of those dark corners of our heart and take the wheel of our life. But I think we should say jealousy doesn't just go, to use the car metaphor, from 0 to 100. It starts with very subtle things. And so as I say these, I want you to think about, do you do this? Or do you think about this, others in this way? It starts very subtly with passive-aggressive remarks or gossip disguised as concern or cold shoulder maybe, a calculated distance that you have from someone else, or maybe withholding genuine encouragement or affirmation from someone. But all that stuff can actually kind of be on the inside too. That can quickly, though, unchecked, turn into something much darker and much more open. Whether it's attempting to sabotage someone's reputation, spread rumors about someone else, or taking steps to actively harm their success. So if you were honest, again here, is there anyone that you would say, man, I guess I haven't thought of it this way, but I actually am trying to undermine them right now because of my envy? Is there anyone that you would criticize behind their back while pretending to support them to their face because you are overrun with jealousy of them? Do you have to be the smartest person in the room? And so when someone talks about an issue that you know something about or believe you know a lot about, do you have to one-up them? Make no mistake, jealousy unrestrained won't just poison your relationships sort of internally. It will also outwardly undermine your relationships as well. So, what is the antidote for this in our relationships? Well, one of the main challenges in a sermon like this, I felt this last week a little bit as we looked at the friendship of David and Jonathan, is that it can quickly turn into a TED Talk. And what I mean by that is, here's how relationships go bad, and here's what to do about it. As if God is like our life coach or our cosmic therapist. I heard it once said that if you can preach or do what I'm doing right now in a synagogue or a mosque or even a community center, and it makes sense to the people listening to it who aren't Christian, you're not preaching a Christian sermon. And so one of the things that we have to really kind of think about here just for a moment is what sets a Christian sermon apart from, sort of just a talk at a community center when we talk about something like relationships. Well, what I think does set a Christian sermon apart is that it doesn't just diagnose the problem, right? It doesn't just prescribe better techniques. It doesn't just offer a few handy relational hacks. right? It helps us do something much deeper. Helps us look into our hearts and see that our biggest problem isn't things necessarily like poor communication or unmet expectations, but it's first and foremost about sin. The world doesn't want to hear anything about that, right? But here in this church, in a Christian church, we should be ready to hear about that. Now, with that being said, though, I think that most Christian sermons end there. Let me tell you what I mean. Many Christian sermons stop at the personal level, like you need to check your heart about jealousy. You need to confess your envy. You need to love better, love others better. And again, while it's no less than that, while personal repentance is absolutely necessary, the Bible never just addresses individual sin. The Bible, particularly what we're getting ready to look at here in the book of Galatians, it actually speaks to how sin corrupts groups of people. So let me get at it this way. You don't have to turn there, but in the book of Galatians, we find the Apostle Paul, as was his custom in many of his letters, writing to a church. Sometimes he would write to a group of church. In this particular letter, he's writing to the Galatian church to, again, as was his custom, to make sure that they were being established and grounded in the Word. And he would do this through a variety of means. He would encourage, he would exhort, he would challenge, he would confront. But what we need to remember, and you've heard us say this here at Mercy View, but when we read a book like Galatians, we shouldn't primarily read it as being written to me as an individual. Not if you're part of a local church. Now, again, it can be applied individually in our lives, but Paul is writing to a church. So the things that he's saying in the book of Galatians is meant to be understood in the context of a group of people. And there's a reason why I'm saying that. In other words, Paul isn't just spurring isolated believers to a stronger faith in the book of Galatians. He is laying down instructions, listen, for how the household of God is to function together. So here's what Paul says to the church in Galatians 5, beginning in verse 16. Again, you don't have to turn there, but just this is my summary here. He tells them to walk by the Spirit so that they can resist the desires of the flesh. Again, he's talking to the whole church on this. And he says, one of the desires of the flesh, and a long list of desires, by the way, is, you guessed it, jealousy. And then Paul goes on to list the fruit of the Spirit after this as a way to sort of like say the inverse of the works of the flesh. It's the fruit of the Spirit. And now I want you to listen to how he ends this section in Galatians 5. He says this, if we live by the Spirit, which I think means we produce the fruit of the Spirit. That's what living by the Spirit means. Let us also keep in step with the Spirit. We continue to cooperate with the Spirit. Then he says this, let us then not become conceited, provoking one another, and listen, envying one another. Within the span of a passage here, Paul highlights, among other things, that jealousy and envy are problems for a church. So why would Paul point that out? Why would he want to let us know, be reminded that jealousy and envy is a work of the flesh that in the context of a local church hurts the church? Well, we have to go to the verse right before this passage, I think, to answer that question. Let me read that for you. This is verse 15 in Galatians 5, right before all of what we just talked about. Here's what it says. It says, but if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. And then he goes into what we just said. Live by the Spirit, produce the fruit of the Spirit, so that you don't become conceited, provoking, and envying one another. So here's what I'm trying to do here. There's the connection. Things like jealousy and envy can spread like cancer and kill the unity of a church easily. But not only that, it sometimes can just straight up kill a church. See, in our flesh, apart from Christ, just like Saul, we thrive on rivalry. We thrive on competition and comparison. Now, there are good versions of that. I'm not talking about the good versions of rivalry or competition or comparison. I'm talking about the negative ones. And I wonder if you've ever felt it in a local church. I pray you haven't felt it here. Maybe you have. Maybe if you've come from other places and some of you have been in the church house for a while and maybe you've had different experiences. I wonder if you've ever felt what I'm talking about here. Like maybe you've experienced this or you've heard others experience this. It's the person who's like getting the ministry opportunities that you want and you feel like you're being overlooked and that jealousy thing starts to bubble up. Maybe it's the person who always knows the right thing to say in a group discussion and you wish you could be as insightful as them. Maybe it's the person who's always so joyful and radiating peace and confidence in every conversation and you envy how they always seem to have it together. Maybe it's the guy who seems to always be on top of his game, like men. You look at this guy and you're like, man, I feel like I'm stuck in a cycle of feeling like I'm barely making any progress at all, and you get jealous of that. Ladies, maybe it's the woman who always looks effortlessly put together, and you would say, God, I always just feel less than that. See, if we let these kinds of things, here even at Mercy View and at Will Rogers, we let those kinds of things get in our hearts, and it doesn't get repented of. It stays unchecked and uninhibited. Friends, I'm just going to tell you, it will end up affecting more than your own heart. It will cannibalize the very relationships that you've been given by God in this church for your good and His glory. We just sang that earlier, right? And the more that you let that grow, the less of a family we become. What ends up happening, and unfortunately I think this is the truth of many churches today, you end up just sort of being a group of individuals that happen to hang out together, but you're disconnected and you're divided. This is not God's heart for us. In fact, sandwiched in the middle of Paul's challenge to walk in the Spirit and not the flesh and renounce things like jealousy and envy, he says this in Galatians 5, verse 24. Listen to this. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Now, we need to be honest here. We read a verse like this and think, man, I haven't crucified the flesh. I believe in God. I follow God. I want to, but I haven't crucified the flesh in the sense that I don't ever struggle with jealousy or envy. That's not what Paul is talking about here. There's really two senses here. Paul is saying that, yes, in Christ, in His death for you, His death forgives you past, present, future for the ways that you fall short of the glory of God. So there is a positional sort of sense here where, yes, when you place your faith and trust in Jesus, your flesh has been crucified. But also Paul, I think, is saying here that those who claim to belong to Christ are actively, let me say that again, actively crucifying their flesh's negative passions and desires. Maybe I can say it this way. You can't claim to belong to Christ if you are nurturing the very things that He died to put to death. Let me say it even more plainly. You can't have Jesus and your jealousy. So, the way that you crucify your flesh and its desires like jealousy and envy is you have to do a couple of things. We're going to land the plane here this morning. This is the third thing that I want you to see. The solution to jealousy is to take in and to trade out. To take in and to trade out. First, you have to take in. So to crucify your flesh, you have to take in the crucifixion of Jesus. Here's what I mean. When you look upon Jesus, in your mind's eye, your spiritual imagination, as you look upon Jesus on the cross, in your place, you realize how misguided it actually is. It should, at least. to let your worth hinge on anyone else's success or anyone else's approval. Like the person whose opinion matters most has already spoken there. And until you get that straight, you will struggle with jealousy. You will struggle with envy. When you take in the crucifixion of Jesus, you can begin to see that the scoreboard that you've been assessing over in your life doesn't even exist in the kingdom of God. Are you with me? Christ's victory is yours. Christ's righteousness is yours. His inheritance is yours. So let's just think about this for a moment. Why would we waste another second envying what has never meant to define us anyways? When Jesus died, your slavery to comparison died with him. And beyond the crucifixion, when he rose to secure your identity forever. And when he ascended, he was enthroned, proving once and for all that your status is found now, being seated with him in glory. Not in climbing the ladder of human approval. You have to take in the crucifixion of Jesus in order to crucify your flesh. Now, some of you here this morning might say, I've never done that ever. I've never taken in, I've never received the reality and the truth and the promise of what the crucifixion secured for me. And so I would want to encourage you this morning to place your faith and trust in that today. Don't waste another moment. Here in a moment, we're going to have communion, and during communion, I believe Orlando and Jill are going to be over here on our prayer team. They would love to talk to you about what it means to take in the crucifixion of Jesus so that you can, moving forward in your life, go, man, my worth doesn't hinge on another person's success or approval. It's secured in Jesus. I'm approved by him. I pray you would make that decision today. But that's the first part, taking in. But second here, I want to just say this as we close. You have to trade out. Here's what I mean. As you work out your salvation and identity in Christ, which is what I think it means to actively crucify the flesh, you have to trade out your jealousy and envy with a few things. And what I'm advocating for here is as you practice these things, you will find jealousy and envy dissipating more and more in your life, all right? First is this. You have to grow in gratitude. You have to acknowledge. Allow the Lord to help you do this. Acknowledge and appreciate what you have without comparing yourself to others. And the way that you do that is by focusing on the blessings in your life. The stuff that God has blessed you with. And just simply being thankful for them. That simple practice alone will change your life. But next, I would add, you have to cultivate celebration. Here's what I mean. You have to make a choice of the heart whenever you're tempted to envy someone else's success, to actually rejoice in that success. Maybe another way, maybe it's not success that you struggle with, it's when you see the blessings that other person is experiencing and you're like, ooh, I wish I had that. But their victories in life, their blessings, their success in life is an opportunity for you to cultivate celebration, to see their victory as a cause for your own joy rather than competition. Next, you need to kindle kindness. One of the things, I remember my mom saying this when I was a kid, like I would be upset or sad or despondent or something, and she said, I know what will solve that. You need to go serve. This is just another way of saying this. Kindling kindness. You have to actively look for ways. And some of you need to start doing this. Ways to bless others and to build them up. What happens when you're blessing others, serving others, building them up? Are you thinking about yourself? No. And what happens is by bringing your elevation of yourself down, you're actually elevating other people in a way that honors God. So kindle kindness. Lastly, you have to choose contentment. Some of you struggle with this, I know, because I hear it sometimes, but like, you look at other people's lives on social media, which, by the way, is curated. You're seeing the best of the best. But you look at other people and you go, man, I am not satisfied with what God has provided for me. So I need to do something that looks like that or maybe better and show others that. So, friends, you have to be satisfied. You must be satisfied with what God has provided for you and find rest in that, or you will be on this endless cycle of comparison and not contentment. If you spend the rest of your life longing for someone else's position in life, you'll waste your life. So I believe, and these are just a few things to think about, but if you trade out your jealousy with kindness and celebration and commitment and gratitude, I'm going to bring this back to the church here. The church, Mercy View, becomes what it was meant to be, a family. Not a fight, but a body of people, not a battlefield. That is how we stand firm together, actually. In gratitude, not jealousy. In celebration, not envy. In kindness and contentment. It's an others-focused, right? That's actually, I said this at the end of our sermon last week, that is also how we reflect the love of Christ to a watching world. Our unity here, our love for one another, our love for Christ in this place is actually the greatest witness to affect the culture outside of these four walls. So let me just say this as we close. Friends, a church that is free of jealousy is a church that is full of joy. So if we're going to fight for something, let's fight for that. A church full of joy, not jealousy. Let's pray together.